Today's daf is daf Mem Vav, and we're going to start with Omer Rabbi Yochanan on the last line of Mem Hey Omid Beis. And we're talking about a machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and Ben Nanas. According to Rabbi Akiva, with regard to the Shtei Lechem and the Kvasim, the two Kvasim that are Shlomim, that are accompanying the Shtei Lechem, the Lechem is primary, and the kvasim are secondary, which means that if the kvasim get lost or destroyed, you still go ahead and do the avodas halechem. Whereas according to Ben Nanas, it's just the reverse. What's critical is the shnei kvasim, and the lechem is dependent upon the shnei kvasim. But Omer Rabbi Yochanan, hakol modim shem huzkiku zelazeh shema akvim zeh
He might
tzeh
go to
shalhem shchita. So what happens is that at some point in time, the Shtei Lechem and the Kvasim become bound together as one carbon, as one entity. And that's going to happen with the Shechita of the Kvasim. As soon as the Shechita, which is the first of the four avodos of the Kvasim, is implemented, at that point, the Shtei Lechem is sanctified, and the kiddush of the Shtei Lechem through the shechita of the Shnei Kvasim now binds them together. That creates what's called a zika. And after the shechita, if, let's say, the Kvasim get lost, then even Rabbi Akiva will concede that you can't bring the Shtei Lechem. And in the reverse case, where, let's say, the Shtei Lechem get lost, then even Ben Nanas would say that you can't bring the Kvasim because of this Zika, which really means that now you're going to have to get rid of the Shtei Lechem and the Kvasim in the various cases that we mentioned, and you're going to have to start from scratch. You're going to have to bring another replacement Shtei Lechem and another replacement of the Kvasim. Omar Ula, Bo b'Marava, and Marava had a suffix, which you'll see is an unanswered suffix. Tnufa osa zika, o ena osa zika. We know that shchita creates a zika and combines the shtei lechem with the shnei kvasim. But what about tnufa? The Torah requires that you do a waving with the kvasim. Does that act of waving have the same status as shchita? And it now creates that bond in which the shtei lechem are totally dependent upon the shnei kvasim. And the Gemara says the following. Why don't you go back to Rabbi Yochanan and his statement and analyze it? Pshotle mid Rabbi Yochanan. You can come to your conclusion based on a meticulous reading of Rabbi Yochanan. Dom Rabbi Yochanan, Shchita Osa Zika. Why didn't Rabbi Yochanan mention a word about Tnufa? Michlal, it would seem to imply that Tnufa ain't Osa Zika, because if Tnufa would generate a bond, a Zika, then Rabbi Yochanan shouldn't have limited his words to Shchita. He should have mentioned even Tnufa. So the Gemara says, you know what? The Rabbi Yochanan Gufa Kaboy Miboile. Meaning, the reason why Rabbi Yochanan didn't mention Tnufa is because Rabbi Yochanan was in the same situation that we're in of doubt and confusion as to whether or not Tnufa has the same status as Shchita to create a Zika. Mifshet Pashat Le Rabbi Yochanan the Shchita Osa Zika. So now we could say the following, that on the one hand, we might argue that Rabbi Yochanan, as you were medayik in his words, was clear and certain about Shechita, that Shechita creates Zika, and he held clearly and undoubtedly that Tenufa does not have the power of creating Zika. But yet, Rabbi Yochanan still had another tzad, and he was in doubt about it. Odilma, perhaps, Shechita pshitale Tenufa mesafkale. Maybe the only reason he failed to mention Tnufa is because he wasn't sure about Tnufa, but Tnufa remains a suffix teku, and we leave this question without any resolution, and we're not sure whether Tnufa can create a Zika or not. Amalei Rabbi Yehuda bar Chanina Rav Huna Berei to Rabbi Yeshua v'hak siv. I don't understand. Are you suggesting the possibility that Tnufa could create Zika? The pasuk says Kodesh Yel Hashem LaKohen. Now keep in mind that the pasuk about Tnufa comes earlier than this pasuk. And the pasuk Kodesh Yel Hashem LaKohen, Basa Tnufa, it's written after the Tnufa. And on this very pasuk, Pligi Rabbi Nanas, Rabbi Akiva, we have the machlokus between Benanas and Rabbi Akiva as to whether or not you can bring the lechem without the kvasim bifnei atzmo, or whether, on the contrary, you can bring the kvasim even without the lechem bifnei atzmo. And that's the two shitas of Benanas and Rabbi Akiva. So that the machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and Benanas applies after Tnufa. Now, why should that be so? If you have a thought that Tnufa, like Shechita, creates a Zika, then Rabbi Yochanan would not offer Rabbi Akiva as a dissenting view against Benanas. So why would there be a controversy between Benanas and Rabbi Akiva after Tnufa? The answer must be, we have no choice but to derive the conclusion that Tnufa certainly is not like Shechita and cannot generate a Zika. But now the Gemara says, you know what? According to your reasoning, I don't understand why Shechita should create a Zika. L'taimech, according to your logic, Basa Tnufa v'lo Basa Shechita, the pasuk of Kodesh Yel Hashem LaKohen, which was the subject of the controversy between Benanas and Rabbi Akiva, appears not only following after Tnufa, but even after Shechita. And yet, in the case of Shechita, we still have the machlok between Rabbi Akiva and Benanas. Elamayis l'meimra mikara koi. What we're going to have to assume is that when we read the psukim, we have to introduce some sort of retroactivity, which means my Kodesh Yul Hashem LaKohen. It doesn't mean that right now it's Kodesh Hashem LaKohen, but rather Dover Shesofo LaKohen. It means that it will eventually be given to the Kohen, and it's destined to be given to the Kohen. But really, this pasuk belongs much earlier. And you read the pasuk as telling you something lemafreya, which means something retroactively. And once you're going to have to come to that answer to explain why Shechita is a mizaka and it creates the zika, then Hachinami Dovish Sofala Kohen, we could apply the same thing and the same methodological understanding of the psukim to Tnufa. And therefore, the fact that Tnufa appears in the pasuk before Kodesh Yil Hashem LaKohen doesn't mean a thing. Now the Gemara wants to question the very premise of Rabbi Yochanan that Shechita creates Zika. Ushchitos is Zika or Minu. What is Rabbi Yochanan going to do with the following brisa? The brisa says, Ad shalosh chata nifras lachma. Nifras lachma means the lechem was broken, and the law is that shtei lechem has to be complete lechem. It can't be broken. And therefore, we can apply the same logic to what's called lachme toda. When the toda was brought by the four categories of people that have to bring a toda because they were saved from imminent danger, then the carbon toda has to be accompanied by 40 lechamim, 40 loaves of bread, that are divided up into 4 different categories, which 10 in each category. And if one of the breads breaks and it's no longer sholem, it's no longer whole, then it cannot be brought. And the halach is the following. It all depends at what point did the loaf of bread break. If it was after shechita, hadam yizorek, habasa yeyachel, but v'yidei neder lo yotza. In the case of a carbon toda, a person, as we said before, experiences one of those four categories of salvation, has an obligation to bring a carbon toda. And if his carbon toda is ineffective, it's invalid, then he has to replace it with another carbon toda. And that's called, in the language of the Brisa, Yidei Nidro Lo Yatsa. He hasn't fulfilled his obligation. But, however, the carbon per se is going to be brought on the Mizbeach. And why is that so? Because the Nifras Lachma, meaning the breakage of the loaf, took place after the Shechita. Now, in order to appreciate what this means, again, we have to know a lot, but just on a superficial level, a carbon toda is a schizophrenic. It wears two different hats, two different identities or personalities. On the one hand, a carbon toda is a carbon toda, but at the same time, a carbon toda is a shlomim. Now, with regard to a carbon shlomim, there's no need or halacha of bringing lechamim, of loaves, to accompany a carbon shlomim. And therefore, even though after the shechita, the loaf of bread broke, and therefore it's no longer kosher to be brought on the mizbeach, but nevertheless, Toda now will take on a different identity, namely that of shlomim, and therefore the carbon will be brought habasa ye'achel. So we go through all the avodos of the carbon shlomim, because now the Toda became a carbon shlomim, culminating in zrikas adam, and after that, the basar could be eaten as any basar shlomim by Yisraelim and Kohanim. However, as far as the Gavra who was obligated in a carbon toda is concerned, obviously he did not fulfill his obligation because this carbon is not a carbon toda. Halechem pasul, and the lechem cannot be eaten. And nizrak adam, if on the other hand, the lechem broke after the zrikas adam, then Torah min hasholim alaparus, he's got to replace that loaf that broke with another loaf of bread that's whole. Now, this bryce has three parts to it. The first part, what we already saw, was addressing a case where the lechem broke. Now, the bryce goes on to Roman numeral number 2, and that is the lechem went out of its confines. Now, what does it mean it went out of its confines, which is called a psul yotze? In the case of a carbon toda, it means the carbon toda can be eaten anywhere in Yerushalayim, and now the carbon left Yerushalayim. It was outside of Yerushalayim. That's called a psul of yotze. And once again, the question is, when did it leave the confines of Yerushalayim? It was before the shechita, after the shechita, before the dam? Ad shalosh chata yatsa lachma. If the lechem of the toda left the boundaries of Yerushalayim before the shechita, is then machnisa v'shochet. Now let's explain. Again, there's a lot of kodshim here, but I'm going to try my best lefi my limited understanding of kodshim. There are two categories of hegdesh in kodshim. There's what's called kedushas damim, and then there's kedushas haguf. The lachme toda, for example, and there are many examples of this, was sanctified with what's called kedushas damim. It will only be upgraded to a kedushas haguf, which is the highest level of kedusha, only after the shechita of the carbon tamid. And in this case, the bread broke before the shechita, which means that the bread only had what's called kedushas damim. I'm sorry, not that the bread broke, that was the first Roman numeral. I'm sorry, the bread left the confines of Yerushalayim before the shechita, then nothing happened. Why? Because the psul of yotze only applies to kedushas haguf, and now the lachme toda before shechita have no kedushas haguf. They only have, as we said, that very limited basic kedushas damim. So all you have to do now is return the shechita back into Yerushalayim, and everything's fine. But mishashchata yatza lachma. If after the shechita now the carbon was upgraded to the status of kedushas haguf, and the lachamim now have kedushas haguf, and all that again is achieved with clinched with shechita, and now all of a sudden the lachme toda, or at least one of the lacham, was taken out of the confines of Yerushalayim. So once again, we don't need the lachamim if we, like Clark Kent and Superman, if you change the identity of the toda and remove its mask, and now it becomes a korban shlamim. Korban shlamim doesn't need lachamim, and therefore the brisa continues: Adam yizorek, habasar yeachel, but yedei nidro lo yatsa. Of course, he hasn't fulfilled his neder because he's only bringing a korban shlamim now, not a korban toda. He's obligated to bring a korban toda, and this korban cannot be a korban toda because after the shechita, which completely binds the korban to the lechamim, and now the lechamim went out of Yerushalayim. If they went out of Yerushalayim, then the lechamim apostle. Hence, the korban cannot be a korban toda, but it could take on its basic identity as a korban shlamim. Now we get to another case. Okay, alechem apostle that we saw already. Now nizrak adam. At what point did the lachamim leave the confines of Yerushalayim? It was after zrika. Zen Torah mimasha b'fnim al shebachutz. Since the zrika clinches the korban, and now the korban is kosher with zrika, and that means that the lachamim were now part of the full-fledged korban, and therefore the neder has been fulfilled. He has discharged his duty, his obligation to bring a korban toda, and then now that he has lechamim, he needs lechamim to replace those lechamim that left the confines of Yerushalayim, and that's what he's going to do. But now we get to the third part of this brisa, and that is ad shalosh chata nitma lachma. So we're not talking about a case where the lechem broke. We're not talking about a case where the lechem left the confines of Yerushalayim, but rather with the case of the lechem that contracted tumah. Now, in the case of tumah, unlike the psul of Yotze, we have what's called the tzitz, and the tzitz is maratza al tumah. You may remember that concept, we had it in the past. And therefore, if before the shechita, the lachme toda became tameh, they contracted tumah, then maybe lechem acher v'shochet. So far, so good. He just has to replace it because, again, it only has kedushas damim and not kedushas guf. So there's no psul in kedushas damim of yotze. But misha shchata nitma lachma. Now what happens is that he already went ahead with the shechita, which means he was makadesh, he sanctified the shtei lechem with the kedushas guf, and now that kedushas guf was contaminated by tumah. So if that be the case, you begin to wonder whether or not he can fulfill his mitzvah of korban toda. So let's just hold off for 1 second. Hasdam yizarek, v'abasa yeachel, v'yedei nidro yatza. He has fulfilled his obligation to bring a korban toda. Now, how can he possibly fulfill his obligation to bring a toda when we're after shechita, and the lechamim were now in this kadshu b'kedushas haguf, and now they were nitmu, they're tameh, they're apostle. But the answer is shatzitz miratza al hatameh. Here, in regard to tumah, we have a special halacha that the power of the tzitz, when it's worn on the forehead of the Kohen Gadol, can turn and convert something that's tameh into tar, as if it was tar, and it becomes halachically tar. However, and again, this is another sugya unto itself, even after the tzitz is maratza, the lechem is still possible. Okay, now we get to a case where the lechem contracted tumah after the zrikas adam. And we said that zrikas adam really clinches the whole carbon, and at that point, the lechem was tahar, is then torim in a tar al atomic. All he has to do is replace the lechem that became tameh with lechem tar. Okay, now after going through this whole brisa with all its three different sections, we come back to ask a kasha on Rabbi Yochanan. If you're right, Rabbi Yochanan, that shchita osa zika, that shchita creates that zika, is kevin shehuzkiku zela zeb shchita. Right, let's say he did the shchita of the carbon toda, and now he has the lechamim, which according to Rabbi Yochanan are now nizkakim, become part of the toda. Then I don't get it. If solei lechem is tipasel lami nami toda. If the bread, let's say, broke, a loaf of bread broke and now becomes possible, or alternatively, a loaf of bread left the confines of Yerushalayim, then now we don't have a tzitz to help us out. Therefore, tipasel, the lechamim are psulim, because the lechem that's broken is pasul. The lechem that left the confines of Yerushalayim is yotze and it's pasul, is tipasel nami toda. The toda, which according to you, Rabbi Yochanan, is now intertwined and bound with the shtei lechem. Why? Because it was after shchita. Then what are you talking about doing a zrikas adam l'shem shlamim? The carbon itself is pasul because of the halach of zika. The Gemara answers shani toda to rachmanakari shlamim. We have a difference between the carbon of toda and the case of shtei lechem. In the case of shtei lechem, the carbon is a carbon shlamim, and that's what it is. And the kvasim now through zika after the shchita are dependent upon the shtei lechem. If the lechem is possibly the yotze, or if the lechem, if the lechem left the confines or was broken, that's it. But in the case of toda, we have something that we could pull out of our pocket. And what's that? Toda could change its identity, and if it cannot be brought with lechem, because the lechem is possible, and therefore you would say that the kvasim likewise are psulim. I'm sorry, not the kvasim, but whatever it is that we need for a carbon toda. Okay, we'll have to fill in that blank. Is now going to be possible because of the principle of zika, but the answer is no, because we have another option. We have a fallback position that the carbon toda now falls back into its category as a shlamim. In brackets, it's very reminiscent of a carbon pesach, chutz l'zmanu. Anyway, but is therefore af toda krevav shelo lechem. You can now bring the carbon toda, but not as a toda without lechem. There's no such thing as a toda without lechem, even if I go like Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Yochanan says Rabbi Akiva's moda that there's no toda here if there was already shchita, because the shchita generates zika, but nevertheless, the carbon toda can be brought not as a carbon toda, but rather as a carbon shlamim. And once again, that would obligate the Baal HaToda to bring a substitute to replace the toda, because he took a neder and he's chayav to fulfill his neder. So we're now on the bottom of Daf Mem Vav Amud Aleph. Amar Rab Yirmiyah, Im Timtza Lomar Tnufa Osa Zika. Right, the Gemara was vacillating back and forth whether Tnufa has the same power and the same efficacy as Shchita according to Rabbi Yochanan, and therefore creates Zika. Then Avad Alechem. Let's say they did Tnufa. And as we said before, in the Shtei Lechem, that accompanied by the Shnei Kvasim, they do Tnufa. They take the Shnei Kvasim and they wave it. And now, after the waving, if we hold that Tnufa like Shchita generates Zika, Avad Alechem, the Lechem was lost. And if the Lechem was lost, then since we're holding that Yesh Zika, that Tnufa created Zika, then the kvasim can't be brought either, because the kvasim now are totally bound up to the shtei alechem, and the shtei alechem were lost.